Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on the podcast, Martin Refalo. And real quick, before I dive in any further, I've heard his name called Refalo lately, and I thought I was getting it wrong, but luckily I have it. So I'm happy to say that I got his name. But Martin, welcome back on the podcast, man. I think this is four now that you've been on. Repeat guest. And yeah, looking forward to chatting with you again today.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, I was going to say, considering this is my fourth time, I'd hope you'd be getting my name right by now. So yeah, looking forward to today.
Like I said, I felt like I thought I was getting it right. And then I heard your name
Mm,
popped up a few times and I'm like, man, I've been getting it wrong this whole time, but I
yeah,
actually had it right the whole time. So
that's right.
awesome. Well, so I think I had it pulled up. It's been at least a couple months since we've had you on. I know there's been a little bit more research that's come out that we're going to talk about. But
hmm
on your end, how's everything been going? Anything new in the last couple months maybe anything that's changed or anything like that? And
hmm
then we can maybe touch on your training a little bit too.
Yeah, the past couple months for me have been comprised of really just conducting my last PhD study. So the one that we'll probably spend some time speaking about today, that takes up a big or a large majority of my time across the week. I've currently got 10 participants running through the second round. So basically, the way the data collection period was set up was the first round, which kicked off a few months back. I had 9 participants then, finished that off in 10 weeks because it's a 10-week intervention. And then I had a bit of a break and started the second round with 10 participants. So I'm about halfway through that second round now. So yeah, that's what the past few months have looked like. I did have a bit of a break there, which was fun, but didn't last long enough because I'm back in the gym now 6, 7 days a week. And the hours I'm spending conducting my study combined with the hours I spend coaching. So I'm still coaching. Coaching is actually getting quite busy now because I have competitors who are 6 to 10-ish weeks out from their competitive season. I have those online clients come in to see me, to train with me, plus my face-to-face clients. So it's a pretty busy period. But I think what keeps me going is the fact I have multiple different avenues that I need to address with my work. I have my research, but then I also have my coaching, and they're different. They're two different things, even though they're on the gym floor. And then I have like other research related work that I need to do on my computer. I have like online client work, different avenues that keep things somewhat fresh and they yeah, I don't feel like my work is stale, if that makes sense. Like I'm not doing the same thing for 8 hours a day. It's a lot of different pieces of work that I have to address. And yeah, 5 more weeks and the study will be complete. And then I can write up my thesis and finish up the PhD and move on, which I'm looking forward to.
So you're pretty close to getting that PhD then. That's pretty soon then.
Correct.
Awesome.
Yeah, so
Congrats.
I should be wrapped up by March of 20. So that's the plan. Yeah,
Awesome.
only a really a matter of months at
Yeah.
this point. And like I said, I'm keen to get that done and move on.
I bet. Yeah. So what does it look like for you then after the PhD is done? Is it just more research then at that point now? Or
Mm.
what are we looking at then?
Yeah. So in the short to medium term, I definitely want to have the rest of the year off
Yeah.
studying in the sense that I don't want to be at university for most of next year because it's either my ninth or 10th year of university post school. So I've been studying really since I left school. So I want to have the year off. And I do want to do some postdoctoral research in another area. If you're listening and you thought a doctorate or a PhD was the highest level of education that you could achieve, it's not. You can do what's called a postdoctorate. Basically, that's just a 2-year full-time research job, really. You get paid to do research for 2 years, and I do want to do a postdoc down the track in another area, of course, related to exercise and nutrition science and just health overall. I don't exactly know which way I want to take that postdoc, but eventually that's what I want to do, and for the rest of next year, it'd just be a matter of resting up a little bit, but of course, working a bit harder at JPS with my coaching and still doing some research in the background. The cool thing is some of my research projects can be conducted from the comfort of my own home. That's, I guess, the flexible aspect of my role. And that's what things look like for me over the next year or so.
Awesome. Yeah. But so just so I understand correctly, like you're able to do, like you said, you're going to do a postdoc potentially but you're still able to do research if you want to continue to do it on failure training and stuff like that. You're still able to do that really whenever you want to, correct?
Yeah, totally. You can always conduct any research that you like. And I think going forward, I'd like to be involved in collaborative research projects. I think from my experience, collaboration is really where you can hammer home a topic because you're getting so many different perspectives and refining those perspectives to come to a robust conclusion. So I want to be a part of more collaborative work that hopefully investigates proximity to failure further. And yeah, like I don't exactly know how far I want to take researching proximity to failure, considering I've been doing that for 3 years straight. But yeah, I guess I've got a bit of thinking to do.
Yep, and hey, taking some time away, that will be perfect, for that. And
Yeah.
and I may miss I think I might have missed. What is the current study that you're in the middle of? What are you
So currently I'm conducting what I think is the first study to reliably compare an RIR based approach to resistance training with training to failure on every set. So there seems to be a slight misconception, at least from what I and scrolling through my social media feed. And that misconception suggests that this type of research has been conducted before. I'm not exactly sure how that misconception arised. Maybe it's due to the recent meta regression that actually explored the influence of specific RIR values, which had never been done before. The key word there is explore. So Zach and the team, which I was a part of, we set out to explore the concept of proximity to failure in a way that had never been done before, simply because that way has limitations. But we acknowledged the limitations along the way. And as you probably know, Jeff, we had to estimate the RIRs achieved, right, across all the groups in each of the studies that we analyze. And of course, all those groups have so many different participants who perform numerous sets. And we had to give one number really to sum up a given group in a given study. And I think that's led some people to believe that, hey, this research has been done before. There have been original research studies that have compared different RIR values. But like I said, that isn't the case. And my study is the first one to do so in what I call an ecologically valid way. And what that means is that, Jeff, if you read through the study design, you should be able to resonate with it. You should be able to say, oh, that's how I would train in practice, right? That's what I would do if I was using an RIR based approach. So, really, I'm prescribing participants an RIR target, but I'm leaving it up to them to terminate the set because that's how things would play out
Yeah.
in practice, right? In the case of failure training, we're employing the definition of momentary failure, right? The point where you are no longer able to complete a full range of motion repetition despite attempting to do. And what I'm doing, which I think people will find interesting, is I'm allocating each of the participants' limbs to one of those conditions, right? So one lower limb, one leg will perform 8 weeks straight of training to failure. The other leg will perform 8 weeks of RIR based training. And we're comparing hypertrophy across the legs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and so this the study you talked about on Revive Stronger with Steve?
Correct.
Okay, so it's that
Yep.
study. Got you.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
I okay, so you are in the middle of that one right now. You finished the first half,
Yeah.
and now you're wrapping up the
Correct.
second half.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think that'll be a great study, and again, it's just going to continue to further advance that part of the research there in terms of the failure research. And so I
Mhm.
do want to touch on that real quick before we dive into that the failure stuff that I want to talk to you about. What's your training like right now, man? How's that looking? Is there anything? Is it just on the back burner, or yeah, what does that look like for you
Mm.
with how busy you are?
Yeah, my training's been pretty stable for most of the year. Recently, though, I have picked up a slight injury, so I do have a
Mm,
hernia, which is very frustrating because it happened on the gym floor. I picked up a 40-kilo dumbbell for a client, felt a pop. This is something I do on a day-to-day basis. I pick up dumbbells and I'm moving weights around. I've been doing so for many years, so quite unlucky, I would say. And basically I can't train legs as hard and as heavy as I'd like, which is fine because legs are a strong point for me, so I can spend a bit more time working on the upper body. So at the moment, I train 3 to 4 days a week. I do some boxing on the side as well, which I enjoy, and that keeps me pretty active on most days. I'd say I do some activity on most days, both for physical and cognitive benefits, and to help break up the day. Because if I don't do that, most of my day is spent focusing on the things that I outlined earlier. And although I did mention I have different avenues of work to address, having some exercise incorporated into the day goes such a long way. And when I do have busy periods and training does get pushed to the side, I feel the effect that has on me, not just physically, but cognitively too. So I think I've got a good combination of exercise and training incorporated into my overall plan. And despite not being able to train as hard and as heavy as I'd like, I'm still training effectively, I think, and enjoying it, which is the main thing. At the moment, most of my training is actually done with some of my online clients. So like I said, I've got online clients who are not too far from competing. So I bring them into the gym, we train together, we push each other, and it makes for some pretty fun sessions where I get to train alongside some of the guys that I'm coaching, which is pretty cool.
Awesome. Yeah. So do you have to get any surgery or anything for the hernia? Or are you just going to or what does that look like?
Yeah, hernia is an interesting injury. Depending on the severity of it, sometimes surgery can be delayed for quite a long period of time. So eventually, to for me to be fully recovered, I do need to get surgery because I need the tear in my connective tissue to be repaired, and it doesn't repair on its own. So eventually that'll have to be the case. It's only a very small hernia. To put into context, it's a 5 millimeter hernia. So it's zero point 0.5, yeah, 5 millimeter hernia, so half a centimeter. It's tiny, but eventually I'll likely need to get surgery on it for it to be fully repaired. So I don't know exactly how that looks at this point because getting surgery would put me out of basically doing anything that involves lifting weights. And that also goes for like, it's probably lifting a 20-kilo plate off the floor. Like I probably wouldn't even be able to do that for a certain number of weeks. And at this point, I can't afford that because I'm running the study, coaching clients. So I'm going to be strategic with when I do that surgery. And at the moment, it's not impairing my well being or my ability to train effectively, really. I'm just going to have to wait it out.
Man, who would have thought that you'd have to push through injury and pain to get through some research, huh? I'm sure they didn't tell you about that
That's right.
beforehand.
Yeah, no, they didn't. Yeah. I spent 10 weeks, man, 10 weeks every day just piling plates on and off the leg press.
Yeah.
And I was deadlifting quite heavy throughout that time period as well. So I'm not, so I think there may have been a cumulative effect of all of that.
Yeah.
And that's what the physio that I'm seeing has mentioned. But it's hard to pinpoint and it's not worth overanalyzing. I'm just moving on.
Yep. I hope you get better there, man. The injuries, yeah, not fun. And obviously, you guess just have to
Mm,
alter the training. But
that's
yeah,
right.
hope you get better soon there with it and get through the research and everything like that. Cool. Let's dive into the topic. You already talked about like one of
Cool.
the studies that you're talking about, but I do want to come
Mhm.
back to that here at the end. But we've had you on before about training to failure. But since we've had you on, there's been you mentioned that Zach Robinson,
Yep.
that study that came out, you were a part of that. You also, we've talked about yours in the past. But so really, how I want to take this is if you can, maybe could just go over the last couple of years, the general like landscape of training to failure research. If you want to touch on yours and then maybe Zach's, and then we can have some discussion around that and see where it goes from there.
For sure. So I think a good place to start is my meta analysis, which I believe we touched on in the last podcast. So prior to the publication of my meta analysis, which a lot of listeners are probably familiar with, most of the studies in this area simply concluded that there was no statistical difference between training to failure and non-failure training. And I think that led many to believe that okay, there's no point of training to failure because there's no statistical difference between those two conditions, right? And if you read through any of the individual papers prior to my meta-analysis, that's likely what you're going to get. And even if you read the meta-analyses prior to the publication of my one, there are two, you'd also read that same conclusion. So the goal of my meta-analysis was to take a similar approach to what had been done in the past, right? So comparing failure and non-failure training but I tried to not dichotomize the results. Now, at the end of the day, there was still no statistical difference between what I classified as momentary muscular failure, which I think is the definition of failure that we're all interested in, right? It's actually objectively failure. There was no difference between that and non failure training. But if you read through the paper in full and you read the practical applications, I spoke about the importance of pushing close to failure because there did seem to be some superior effect of training to failure, right? It was just quite small. It was trivial and it wasn't picked up as statistically different. And of course, in practice, there are reasons and benefits to training to failure. So I didn't want to leave a conclusion that was similar to some of the prior conclusions I described earlier. So that meta analysis was also the first to critique definitions of failure and actually separate studies based on their definitions of failure and to also look at velocity based studies, so studies that use velocity loss to control set termination. And across all of those themes, if you will, results seem to be quite similar. Now, I mentioned in that meta analysis that we still don't know the optimal proximity to failure for muscle hypertrophy because from the research we have, we can't derive, it's basically impossible to derive an accurate RIR value from the groups that are part of these research studies. And the main reason is that previous research studies in this area simply haven't used an RIR based approach to set termination and they just haven't paid attention to it. And the RIR that participants achieve likely varies, right, across sets, right, across groups, and across studies. And that's what makes it quite difficult to infer the specific proximities to failure, right, that are going to best promote muscle hypertrophy. So the next step was to explore that exact issue, right, that exact limitation in the research. So with the subsequent meta regression, which is basically it's similar to a meta analysis. It's analyzing data in a slightly different way. What the team did was estimate the RIRs that were achieved across the groups in all of these studies, and that allowed us to explore the dose response relationship between RIR itself and muscle hypertrophy. And what those findings suggest, or for me, what they suggest is they reinforce the importance of training close to failure for muscle hypertrophy versus for strength development. So proximity to failure seems to be a variable that is more important when the goal is muscle hypertrophy, whereas when the goal is strength, there seems to be other variables that should be prioritized. So what we saw there was we saw as sets were terminated close to failure, muscle hypertrophy increased, but we can't make confident claims about the effect of specific RIR values because of the uncertainties that are baked into the data set that we use and the methods that we employed to analyze the data. Yes, it's the best that we can do with the literature we have, but we do have to acknowledge that and the confidence and the credence we award these findings and that we put into our claims need to be adjusted based on those uncertainties, right? And that's not necessarily a negative thing. I think the scientific perspective needs to embrace uncertainty and needs to strive to fill knowledge gaps long term. So the key word there is long term in the sense that one specific study doesn't have to fill knowledge gaps, right? Not every single study has to have firm, concrete conclusions that are confirmatory, right? Studies can be designed to be exploratory to inform future research investigations, and that was the intention there. And as researchers and as people who are consuming research, people interested in evidence based practice, we need to maintain a state of intellectual humility. So we need to acknowledge the uncertainties, right? We need to acknowledge what we know, but also what we don't know. And we also need to maintain a state of perpetual curiosity so that further investigations can be conducted, right? We need to maintain curiosity. one study shouldn't be used to firmly conclude the effect of any given training protocol or nutritional intervention on the outcomes that were analyzed, right? It's always that given study along with the totality of the literature, whilst maintaining curiosity and acknowledging that future research may have something slightly different to say. So that's where things are at the moment for me. And like I said, this study reinforces the idea that has stood the test of time, right? The idea that training has to be hard to build muscle, and that an element of that term hard is proximity to failure, right? As coaches, this is something that we need to hammer home to our clients. It's something that we need to keep an eye out for, and we need to somewhat train, because I think pushing close to failure is it's like a trainable skill. It's probably something you've observed, Jeff, in yourself and in your clients. And at the end of the day, I think it's worth having a discussion about what hard actually means for muscle hypertrophy. I think that term gets thrown around too much on social media, and people may struggle to define it in the context of hypertrophy. So maybe we can table that for later. And really, what I'm getting at here is, though we know how important proximity to failure is now for muscle hypertrophy, that does not mean we should be making training harder and pushing clients to failure just for the sake of it, right? There's always things you can do, Jeff, in your training to push further to failure and to make training quote unquote harder, right? You can do 10 sets of 10 with triple drop sets on every set and push them all to failure on a Bulgarian split squat, and that'll do it for pretty much anyone. But does that need to be done to maximize muscle hypertrophy? Do you need to go to that extent? That's what I'm interested in, because I think there's a line we have to draw somewhere, and I'm interested in knowing where that line is, right? And I want to know how close we should be getting to that line repeatedly over time to get the best outcomes, whilst acknowledging that line is probably further ahead than what most people think, right? In other words, most people can probably train harder or more effectively than they think they are. This goes for most people. I'm sure you'd agree, Jeff. It only takes one session with a training partner to realize that. And I think the goal over time is to, as a coach and as a trainee, is to learn how to push closer to that line strategically over time, and hopefully, follow a sustainable long-term program that is hard enough to promote muscle hypertrophy, whilst using the understandings that we're really deriving now from the research that is coming out. Hopefully that makes sense. And I think that's, for me, that's the landscape of training to failure, and to some extent, some practical applications there as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you summed that up perfectly. So I also like a couple things you said. What is hard training, right? It's not just like you said, like just doing 10 by 10 and drop all this, all that stuff that you see on social media and whatnot. So I definitely want to talk about that because I think that is a good topic. So it sounds like right now, in terms of this failure research, when it comes to muscle growth, is basically what we've gotten out of it so far is like you do want to get closer to failure, but then it's in terms of the exact numbers, that's where you're trying to figure out right now exactly
Mm.
what that means. It's, hey, yes, we know we want to get closer to failure, but where exactly do we want to go with it? And from my understanding, that's what you're trying to do here now with your current study that is going to come out at some point.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. If you had asked me this question about 2 years ago when I was writing up a scoping review on this topic, and I was voicing my concerns about the literature and its limitations, I would have said, yes, I'm really interested in knowing the exact RIRs that we need to achieve in training to promote muscle hypertrophy. But at this point, I'm simply more interested in just an RIR based approach, just generally, right? So, what I mean by this is, look, we know training has to be pushed close to failure. So, within those remain either to failure or very close to it, we know that. I think an RIR based approach can help us get there. And I'm less concerned about the exact numbers, the exact RIR values. So in the study I'm currently conducting, yes, I've prescribed RIR values, Jeff. So I've said to my participants out on the leg press, you need to terminate your sets at what you think is a 2 RIR. On the leg extension, I need you to terminate your sets on what you think is a 1 RIR. But there have been instances, for example, where people may have overshot that target. Maybe they've actually reached failure when they were supposed to get to a specific RIR value. And Jeff, that happens to all of us in training. That's probably happened to you. It's happened to me. Sometimes you underpredict, sometimes you overpredict. And what I mean by this is that is an RIR based approach. That's how things play out in practice. So I'm more interested in how that approach compares with pushing to failure on every single set. So yes, I'm prescribing the RIR values, but I know there's going to be some degree of inaccuracy when it comes to the actual set termination points. And that's cool as long as they're close enough to failure, which they all are. We should be seeing some muscle hypertrophy. And is that muscle hypertrophy similar to what we see when all sets are pushed to failure? Or is it superior? Or is it slightly less than what you'd achieve if you pushed every set to failure? So I think that's where my head is at right now with my investigations. And I think that's the most practical outlook because the way I coach RIR, and I think the way it should be coached for the best long-term outcomes is to think of RIR as sitting on the same side of the fence as pushing to failure. So for some reason, there seems to be this dichotomy between pushing to failure and training with reps and reserve, right? When in reality, those two ideas, they sit on the same scale. They operate on the same scale, right? So the RIR scale has that momentary failure point embedded into it. And in practice, right, there is no one client of mine that only trains to failure or only leaves reps in reserve. It's a combination of both all times because there's no reason to dichotomize the two. And although we tried to uphold that idea with the meta regression by looking at the dose response and looking at how things play out continuously. So instead of comparing two separate things, we compared multiple RIRs with failure. People have still went on to dichotomize failure training with RIR, even though that wasn't the intention. The intention was to zoom out and be like, hey, this is how things look across the whole RIR scale. It still seems like it's, at least from my observations of the people I speak to, it still seems like it's okay. Train to failure is over there on that side of the fence, and RIR is still here. Whereas for me, that's not only has that never been the case, it's actually reinforced how important it should be to combine both approaches in one when working with clients for sustainable, long term, hard training that is stable across different circumstances. Jeff, if I was coaching you and you went into a contest prep and your stress levels were super high and your sleep started getting disrupted, I need a method to that is conducive to that, right? If I'm only telling you to train to failure and to maximize the number of reps you complete on every single set, what do I do when you're in that position? Do I keep telling you to do that? Or do I just say, hey, pull it back a little bit? Just go a little bit lighter this week. But isn't that subjective? Wouldn't you say that's more subjective than RIR prescription, which people usually criticize for being subjective, right? I would say RIR prescription in that case is actually more objective because I'm giving you an objective number to reach for. It just happens to be that the subjective prediction of RIR is on you and is thus subjective. So that's where I'm at the moment. I'm trying to build a system that I can coach across all my clients, across a wide population over time throughout many circumstances. I'm trying to teach people about that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's a good point you bring up. I think I made this point the other day too in one of my posts where I was like, people do, it's like, hey, it's either failure training, it's super hard, or not failure training, it's super easy. And that's not the case. And I think this was what you were trying to find out. We had this conversation in the past about different RARs and how it's, or how they would, maybe in the research, they used to explain it as like non-failure training, but it was like, that could have been one RAR, it could have been five, you don't really know. And so again, there does seem to be that kind of black or white thinking with it when,
Mhm.
like you said, you can combine both of them in it. And it's like 1 to 2 RAR is still that's tough training still at the end of the day. And if it's not, it's probably not 1 to 2 RIRs. Is there anything else? So like on the failure to research or training to failure research before we get a little bit deeper into RIR, is there, I guess from a practical standpoint, I think you've hit on it. Does it simply just come down to, again, you're just trying to get people closer to failure more times than not for muscle growth? Was there any maybe other like practical takeaways from the research that you have from that's out there right now?
The one interesting aspect of the meta regression was that we looked at potential variables that could moderate the relationship between proximity failure and muscle hypertrophy. And there were many different variables we looked at: training status, right? Age, the load being lifted, the relative load lifted. And all those variables that we selected as potential moderators did influence the relationship between proximity failure and muscle hypertrophy to some extent. And they basically weakened that relationship, particularly when the load lifted was quite high. So, a load that we would deem a high load. So what this means to me is that the ground we're standing here is a little shaky in the sense that the relationship between proximity to failure, or the supposed relationship, right? The suggested relationship, because it's not the confirmed relationship, it's a suggested relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy. It's influenced by the allocation of all the other possible training variables you could embed into a program, and by important individual factors, right? That's another layer that is even harder to investigate. But for example, training status is one of them that is quite explicit. But of course, there are implicit factors that need to be considered in practice. Like I said, your stress levels, right? Your sleep, your nutrition, all of those factors also likely come into play. And this is where in practice, right, it always boils back down to practice. I try and convey a practical message, right? As a coach, you need to be aware of these interactions, and you need to have a system in place to deal with these interactions. And if you don't, you'll eventually find out why that is so important if you work with enough clients over time. So I think that's another takeaway from the recent work that has been done: the fact that other variables play a large role and can either strengthen or weaken the relationship that we are interested in, at least for the context of this discussion. And when it comes to proximity failure more generally, recent research has also shown that individuals can be quite accurate with their RIR predictions, right? And I think this is quite promising, and just shows that if you're coaching, you need to be deliberately teaching your clients how to push to failure and how to then pull back and stop at a certain RIR if you want RIR training to be highly effective. So, Jeff, what you have to remember is that what people have to remember just generally is that RIR is just a tool, it's a coaching tool, right? So, how well it is coached, right, is going to influence how effective it's going to be. So it's not just a matter of picking it up and using it in every single circumstance. You have to choose your circumstances wisely, and you have to coach it in a way that is going to be conducive to its intended use, right? So I have some research coming out very soon, in the coming days, actually, that I conducted last year looking at RIR accuracy. And this study was conducted in a resistance trained sample. So individuals with a minimum of, not a minimum, but an average of 8 years training experience across the sample. It was slightly higher than that, males and females. And 96% of the sample had experience using RIR and had trained to failure and had experience working with a coach. So it was a sample that I would say is conducive to using RIR in practice. And what we found when predicting a 1 RIR and 3 RIR was quite a high degree of accuracy, right? So the 1 RIR prediction, for example, was on average less than half a rep away from the RIR target, which means on the bench press exercise, and the 3 RIR was just under a full rep from the RIR target, right? We have C, which is like 0. If you've hit the target, that's a 0. You're on target. And then you can be within 1 rep away or within 2 reps away. So on average, people were within a rep away from failure. And of course, the study setup, the being set up, being part of a study and deliberately having to deliberately predict RI, that's a little bit different to what happens in practice when you're just out there training and you've got a program and it's not as regimented as like a study design would be. People are literally being put to the test here, whereas in practice, you're left on your own. So there is that difference to consider. But it's promising to know that people do have or can build this perception of their proximity to failure, and we can capitalize on that understanding as coaches. And of course, it's going to be different across exercises, etc. But when people make the claim of RIR not being useful because it's subjective, for one, and because people are inaccurate, for me, that claim only stands its ground across certain populations. If we're speaking about someone who's never stepped foot into the gym, then I'm somewhat on board with that. But if we're speaking about resistance trained individuals who have experience in the gym and experience with pushing to failure and potentially experience with RIR, then I dare say that isn't the case. And a good coach can only help improve that. So that's where I'm at with some more recent research that has also been coming out. I'm also going to be a part of, which has made its rounds across social media as well. It's important to remember that all of these kind of claims and findings, they are specific to certain populations, right? And it's important for coaches to keep that in mind in practice.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear on the RIR because I do feel like you said some of the when people say that it's not great, it's because oh, most people aren't accurate with it. But as you're coming to find out, people are actually fairly accurate with the RIR. It's just again, like you said, somebody that's brand new to training, okay, maybe they're not going to be great, but you can obviously teach them to get them better at it over time. But most people that have been training for a while, they push to failure. They generally have a pretty good idea of like they're pretty accurate with their RAR targets. So again, showing that you can use this in practice with people.
Yeah, especially when training is pushed close to failure, right? Jeff, if I tell you to stop a set at 5 reps in
It's
reserve
gonna be
or
hard.
6 reps in reserve, look, but that's not an issue with the RIR prescription itself. That's an issue with how I'm coaching it.
Yeah.
So would I recommend that? Probably not. But if I tell you across all your exercises that you've got planned for this afternoon, if you're going to the gym, if I tell you to keep 1 rep in reserve, I can be pretty damn confident that you're going to be within the proximity to failure necessary to get a robust hypertrophy stimulus, right? Because I know your training background. I know you push to failure. I've seen you train. I know you can do it. So that would be a wiser approach. Again, just an example and another way of highlighting how the way RIR is coached is important. Right? It's just a tool and you have to use it wisely.
Real quick, so one more thing on this before we dive a little bit more into RIR. So the fatigue side of things, again, we know from the failure research that we want to generally get closer to failure. At some point, you did some research on like the fatigue cost of that. So is that something that you want to take into consideration with all this, or where do we stand with that?
Yeah, I think that always has to be considered in practice, right? It's pretty clear that the closer you terminate a set to failure, the larger the fatigue cost. And that has to be considered in the context of the whole training session that you're programming for a client and the frequency of which training needs to be completed across the week. So for me, it's sitting down and writing a program. It's looking at the broad and the global stimulus to fatigue that we're achieving. I think, for example, it might be worth keeping a rep or two in the tank on a leg press if you're doing a leg session, but then pushing to failure the leg extension at the end of a session, right? So if you've got a leg press coming up first, and that's followed by subsequent quad exercises, it might be worth considering how the fatigue of one exercise that is quite a high threshold exercise, an exercise that's going to come naturally with a lot of fatigue, how that's going to interact with subsequent exercise. And that's the beauty of RIR is being able to say, okay, on this exercise, I want you to push hard, but I want you to exhaust yourself maximally. Right. But then on this other one, I want you to take it to the house and push as hard as you can. Right. It's a versatile way of programming that I think is stable long term, like I said, across multiple circumstances, especially when you consider, Jeff, that fatigue or fatigability just generally differs across individuals. It's going to change over time due to external circumstances. And all of those considerations have to come into play when you're designing a program, right? There's just no one size fits all approach, right? For some clients, I program low volume, close to proximity to failure. Others, it's slightly higher volume, right? Still close to failure, but being a bit smarter about which exercises I'm pushing to failure and not. So for me, that's where the fatigue aspect of fatigue comes in. It's trying to manage that well across a session and over time, and that differs across individuals. And we do still need to better understand the interaction between fatigue itself and muscle hypertrophy over time. That interaction is yet to be explored in a way that allows us to make interpretations which we can immediately implement into a program. At this point, most of the research on fatigue has been done acutely. For example, the study I conducted last year, I would call that an acute study in the sense that I was looking at how fatigue is generated across just a session and then in the subsequent 48 hours. But of course, Jeff, when you're programming for a client, you're more interested in, okay, how is fatigue going to interact with the outcomes I'm after across a 6 to 10 plus week block of training? And that is still yet to be explored. Now, another cool aspect of the study I'm currently conducting is along the way, I'm also assessing fatigue in the sense that I'm assessing the fatigue accumulated on the leg press using a velocity tracker because the speed at which you complete your reps is a proxy for the fatigue that you are accumulating. This is pretty obvious, Jeff. If your reps are slowing down across sets, you're likely more fatigued than if your rep speed was consistent across all sets. So that's what I'm doing to provide a bit more insight into how things play out over time when you're performing the same exercise over and over again. Is fatigue staying the same across the 8 weeks, or is it going up, or is it actually decreasing, maybe because of the repeated bout effect? So there's a lot of different talking points here, definitely a lot of different talking points. And like I said, there's no one size fits all. But for me, it still comes down here to have a stable long term plan that works well across all your clients and over time. You need to have a fatigue management system built in. And for me, that's just simply using RIR wisely, pushing some exercises to failure and others keeping some reps in reserve.
Do you also think too that there's like a little bit of it comes down to the person as well too, like knowing the client in terms of like how
Mhm.
much you want to push them as well too. I'm sure that plays a big role in it. Some people probably like pushing super close to failure. Some
Okay.
people probably don't
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah. So now you're stepping outside of the fatigue zone
Okay.
and you are speaking about perceptual responses, which
Okay.
brings up a whole bunch of other talking points, right? So yes, we have fatigue. All right, that's cool. Fatigue's spoken about a lot. What isn't spoken about all too often is perceptual responses to resistance training. Now, I think one of the reasons that we don't see perceptual responses being discussed much on social media is because many of the individuals, at least again, this is from what I observe. I'm not on social media all day. I follow a certain bunch of people. I see posts pop up. I'm not all over it. But if you're only working online and you're not seeing clients face to face, it's quite hard to appreciate the influence that perceptual responses to resistance training can have on long term outcomes, on adherence, on motivation, on self efficacy. There are so many, again, talking points that come out of the points you just raised. And I think I've worked with clients now for 8 years on the gym floor, and I see how people respond. I literally see how people respond to training. And I've also conducted research on this, and I don't think I need research to explain what I'm saying here, but it reinforces the points I'm trying to make. When you push someone close to failure, they can either enjoy it, they can either feel positive benefits of it, right? They can feel positive after it. Other people will have a completely different feeling, right? They'll have a more negative feeling. And this is something that did last year, and I'm currently doing at the moment as well with my studies, is after sets are performed, I'm asking people how much discomfort they feel. And this discomfort ratings vary widely. So some people who might have a high pain tolerance don't feel that much discomfort after pushing to failure, right? Other people do, right? I'm also asking people, like I'm literally asking them after training, right? How do they feel, right? And there's a scale, right? We have a scale to try and objectify this. How do you feel? 0 is neutral. Positive numbers mean that you feel good. Negative numbers mean that you feel bad. Right? I'm asking them about perceptual responses. I'm asking them about the exertion that they think they've had to apply in the sessions, because I think all of these factors are also really important in practice, right? And on social media, the message that we see is you got to train harder. You've got to push harder. And again, I think it's worth speaking about the term hard itself, but I can understand why on social media that's as far as a message really goes. You just have to push harder because you're trying to get that message across to a lot of people, and you can't give very specific advice, Jeff. It's very hard to do that. But the problem is when coaches on the gym floor see that message on social media, okay, you have to train harder, and then apply it to all their clients without giving that specific advice. And that's something that I've observed to some extent in the discussions I've had recently. And what I'm trying to say is when I'm on the gym floor, before I send that message, before I tell my clients to train harder, I am giving them specific advice, right? And that specific advice is then overlaid with you have to train harder over time. I say train harder like every single day,
Yeah.
so many times a day, but it always comes with specific advice. And I think that's for me where my primary concern lies. It's coaches on the gym floor taking that message that they're seeing on social media, which I mean, I think is an okay message because you're trying to get it across to thousands of people, but you've got to filter it down and be a little more strategic about the way you are conveying the message to clients one on one. And of course, that's my passion point, being a coach. That's my primary work is face to face coaching, online coaching. For me, communication is crucial, right? And I think social media muddies the waters. There are benefits to social media, no doubt about that. But on the gym floor, we have to be a little bit smarter about how we are conveying our message. So, is that making sense?
Yeah, let's dive into that then, because I know I did want to park that what is hard training, So, now that we're on that topic,
Mhm.
like, what does that look like? What do we need to tell people here on this? Because I get what you're saying, where it's like, okay, so now we have this research that comes out, hey, we want to push closer to failure. So people are like, hey, we need to train harder for muscle growth. But then,
Mhm.
like you said, that can lead to who knows what that can lead to when you tell people to train harder, right? Like you said, hey, they're just going to go
Mhm.
do 10 by 10s. What does that look like? And what do we need to do better to communicate there?
Yeah, for me, hard training is technically hard training in the context of muscle hypertrophy
Right.
is imposing a mechanical tension stimulus that exceeds the threshold required for adaptation. And to be more specific, it's repeatedly imposing that stimulus, right? That exceeds the threshold required for adaptation. But that definition there, which I'm probably going to work on over time and it's probably going to involve, that definition is confined by my understanding of physiology and all the interactions that take place when you quote unquote push hard and practicality, right? Training has to be sufficiently hard, right? And if it's sufficiently hard, once you've reached that point, you can potentially push harder and maybe get an even better response, or maybe there's diminishing returns. It's hard to know exactly how things play out in that zone. But at the end of the day, we do have to confine that with okay, what are the interactions? What are the subsequent effects of pushing hard? And practical implications, which we've discussed. For example, the perceptual response to resistance training, subsequent adherence to training sessions, etc. For me, technically, that's what hard training is. It's boiled down to the physiology, right? It's mechanical tension. That's what we're after. And we need a sufficient amount of mechanical tension in a given area to allow for hypertrophy, right? In that given area, in that muscle group. Now, technically, that's what I'm thinking, right? Obviously, when I'm communicating, things are a little bit different. And I think where things get a little bit tricky on the level of an individual, like on the level of a client who This is what we're concerned about, is helping people improve. There is a difference between what some people perceive to be hard and what some people subjectively think is hard. There's a difference between that and the definition I just described. That's the disconnect that I'm interested in trying to address when I'm working on the gym floor with individuals. So I'm not giving them that exact definition that I described. I'm trying to clear up that disconnect between what they subjectively feel is hard and what I actually think is hard and is going to promote muscle hypertrophy. Because that message on social media, the train harder message, it gets filtered down all the way down to people on the gym floor. And Jeff, training hard, that feeling of hard, it can mean so many different things. Discomfort, for example, it's a great example. I always use it. Discomfort, perceived discomfort, can vary widely across individuals. And it is a hard feeling, right? If the discomfort of your training is quite high, you're going to perceive that training to be hard. Now, does that match up with the definition I proposed earlier? Not so much, right? Discomfort's going to play a role, right? To meet the criteria for that definition I proposed earlier, there's going to be a level of discomfort, right? But that doesn't mean a level of discomfort is always going to translate to training that is going to maximize muscle hypertrophy, right? And there's so many, again, different avenues we can take that, right? If you ask 20 people on the gym floor what hard is, they're probably going to give you a wide range of answers, right? I've actually done this in a presentation before. I've asked a group of like 30 students, what does intensity mean? And I had all their answers pop up on the presentation slide. And this was a room of coaches and a room of trainees, and most of the answers were different. And this was for the term intensity, which is supposedly an exercise science term that is cemented in of experience and research. But there was still such a wide range of answers. And I dare say the same result, I would get the same result if I had asked the room, hey, what does hard training mean? Okay, so for me as a coach, it's clearing up that disconnect because I know my clients are at risk of thinking a session has been hard and thus feeling confident in the results that they've likely obtained from that session. But if we dig a little bit deeper, there's probably cracks there that need to be filled, right? And what that looks like in practice for me is okay, on given exercises where I think discomfort can be quite high, where I think the aerobic demand is quite high, and I think clients are at risk of terminating their sets prematurely on those exercises. As a coach, I'm going to have to spend a bit more time with these clients on. I'm going to have to actually teach them what true failure is going to feel like, and then work back from there. So that's like the thought process that I'm trying to employ to then teach the client and get them to feel what failure feels like and compare that to what they were previously feeling, right? Which is very elucidating, right? Especially for clients who I find this to be the case a lot for not just beginners, right? But intermediate clients who have actually been in the gym for quite some time, but they really haven't been thinking too much about their training. They just walk into the gym and they just train and they think they're training to failure, but they're not actually trained to failure. Like they train until it really hurts and they just drop the weights. Yep, that was it for me. And I'm thinking, hold on a second. Let's do things a little bit differently. Let's maybe choose a different exercise or maybe provide you with a bit more stability on that given exercise. Let's adjust the load. Let's bring the load up a little bit more and let's actually see what failure feels like. So for me, it's that intermediate group of individuals who've actually been in the gym for quite some time, probably made some really good gains, who to take the next step and get into the advanced kind of category, if you will, they need to know and need to be able to reach failure on multiple exercises, right? But then also learn how to pull back slightly so that their training can be stable long term and so that they can maximize the stimulus achieved not just in one given set, but across multiple sets and across multiple workouts over time and across periods of time when they're in a surplus and they're in a deficit or they've got good sleep or they're lacking sleep or high stress, low stress. I need to find a method that's stable for them over time because for me, that's where a lot of people really struggle when they're on their own, Jeff, is they made some good gains, they're years into their training, they pick up more responsibilities, life gets busy, and because they don't have this level of understanding, and they just think that it's a matter of going to the gym and making their training feel hard, right? Imagine just subjectively, just for a second, just think about how that would play out subjectively over time. That feeling of hard it's just going to vary day to day, week to week based on life, really. And so the stimulus that they're actually achieving from their sessions and over time, that's also going to vary, right? It might be decreasing when they perceive it to actually be increasing because training feels harder, but it could be feeling harder for many reasons, right? So again, for me, it's these conversations that I'm having on the gym floor, literally these conversations that I'm having with you now that I'm using to help clear up that that disconnect. Hey, this is what I need you to feel. This is what I think is going to really promote muscle hypertrophy. We need to be within a strike zone. Then I give him the strike zone. So let's try and objectify it. Within 2 reps from that feeling of failure. If you're there over time on this exercise, I'm going to give you a thumbs up. But that's got nothing to do with the discomfort that you feel and how much you're huffing and puffing during your training and all the other factors that kind of feed into your ability to do an effective set. So for me, that's hard training, and the concern is that disconnect, right?
Yeah, I can relate because it's always when I do try to give out advice on social media, it is really hard to be like, hey, you need to train harder. But again, I always try to preface it by saying this doesn't just mean you just need to like lift more weight or just get your heart rate up or it just has to feel super challenging. And it can be tough to explain that and get
Mhm,
get that down. And like you said, I think it's some people are going to take it differently. So learning how to be able to explain that, I think, is super key. And it sounds like one of the key things there is teaching them how to get to failure at some point what that looks like. And then from there, you can start to maybe prescribe this
mhm.
RIR a little bit more effectively than at that point.
Yeah, for sure. And remember, we're speaking primarily about proximity failure here, but there are other variables in practice that we have to employ. I think that's another thing that social media struggles with because there's always a hot topic. It could be anything. If you've been in the industry long enough, these hot topics come and go. And the thing is, if you're attached to social media and that's your primary source of information consumption, your attention is going to be determined by what is trending on social media. That's how it's playing out. Your attention is not determined by what you think is important, by what social media thinks is important. And I see coaches all the time being hyper focused on whatever variable is trending on social media and starting to dismiss, not necessarily dismiss, but place less attention on all the other variables that you also have at your disposal as a coach, right? So I always say you shouldn't change, you shouldn't adjust your coaching philosophy or your training philosophy. You're just a trainee overnight. Doesn't happen overnight, and it shouldn't happen with social media trends. It should happen slowly over time, right? As you consume this information, you digest it, you try and implement it, you read opposing views and different perspectives, and you slowly update that philosophy over time. But at the moment, people are updating their philosophy, at least from what I observe in the conversations I have, based on social media trends. Okay. And I think the one thing that you shouldn't do as a trainee or as a coach is be hyper focused on any one given variable, right? I've heard of stories of people just getting demotivated to train just because they've signed up to an online coach who's given them this program that is like solely focused on biomechanics or it's solely focused on RIR or it's all about volume. And because they just can't facilitate that training program in practice, they're left feeling demotivated and they stop training for a certain period of time, right? Those case studies, they exist. Those people exist. I've spoken to these people, and that's what I'm trying to fix, if you will, with the message that I put across. And I think that the only way that you can do this effectively is through like podcast discussions, through long form discussions, right? I completely resonate with your struggle, Jeff, when making social media posts. It's hard to get the message that you want across on social media. And so I think these discussions are invaluable. Big thanks to you for helping facilitate them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's hard to get your message across. You have to do it like in a short, concise way as well to keep people's attention. So
Mm.
it's super challenging. I know you wanted to also hit on RAR even more. We've obviously been talking about it, but is there maybe how do we might have been hitting on this at least throughout, but I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to hit on in terms of how to apply it in practice and as a coach, because I know that you've had a lot of experience around RAR here in the last couple of years. And again, now you're study coming up is heavily
Mm.
involved with RIR. So I'm just curious to hear how we can maybe wrap this up and how we can apply RIR in practice and as a coach and maybe some other things that that we missed that you want to hit on here
Yeah.
with RIR.
Yeah, for sure. So I do think we touched on it as we went on, which is good because I can bring it together here and hopefully provide some further practical applications. But I think it all starts with realizing that RIR is just a tool. Okay. So you don't have to use that tool with yourself. You don't have to use that tool with all your clients. If you're a coach, it's just a tool and you have to use it wisely. Now, when you use RIR, I did bring this up earlier, you have to remember that it operates on the same scale as pushing to failure. So to use RIR is not to say that you're not training to failure. For me, that doesn't comprehend for me like that just it doesn't work that way. That's never a thought that goes through my head. If you watch me train, if you watch my clients train, whether they're beginners, intermediates, or advanced, like in a whole session, they're pushing some sets to failure. They're pushing at least something to failure, no doubt, maybe multiple sets to failure, but they're also keeping some reps in reserve here and there. And that's what I meant earlier when I said, hey, these two ideas, right, they should sit on the same side of the fence. And for me, that's a strategy that I can apply across a wider range of clients, right? As long as I time it correctly. If we're thinking very practically here, when I have a new client sign up to me, it's not like the first thing I do is teach them about RIR. It's like there's a whole host of other priorities that I need to focus on and I need to get their attention to, right, before I speak about RIR. So the first few weeks of training, maybe the first month or the first block in general, it's watching them train, it's pushing them hard towards that strike zone, what I subjectively think is a strike zone, teaching them about perceived discomfort, all of these things, right? Pushing them to failure on certain exercises, getting them to feel what it's like. And when I think they're ready, that's when I'm going to use the RIR tool. Right? I think if just because I don't subscribe to any given training method, right? I'm not an RIR guy. I research it because I'm interested in it, and I'm more interested in the kind of the long-term idea of training needing to be hard to promote muscle hypertrophy. I just so happen to focus on RIR as a variable, but I don't use RIR with all my clients. I use it with most, but not all, and I think I use it because I think it's a good, stable, long-term method, right? I don't just use high volume. I don't just use low volume. And I think this should be the case for most coaches, right? Like I said before, if you've worked with enough clients over time, you've seen these clients face to face and seen the response over time, you'll know that things just can't be the same for everyone, right? And this is where the top down versus bottom up approach comes into play. So, top down meaning, okay, I can take a top down approach by looking at all the evidence we have, thinking about my anecdote, putting them together, and then applying those kind of principles and that understanding across all my clients. Right? That would be a top down approach. Bottom up would be just looking at the client themselves individually and thinking about what's going to work best for them based on what I know about them. Now, taking either of those two approaches in isolation is probably going to be limiting long term for you as a coach. So you need to somehow find a way to combine both. Now, what I do is I start off by employing more of a top down approach, right? This is generally what I've seen to be the case in research. This is our starting point based on my experience, refining that slightly. This is the starting point for clients because I don't know about you as a new client. It's going to take me a bit of time to assess your response, diagnose the response, and see how you individually react to the program. And then over time, things will become more bottom up. And I'm trying to bring it in to the middle, but it's starting from top down. And I think that's such a useful thought process to have when you're working with clients. And it means that you're not subscribing to any one approach. Yes, you're starting with what might work broadly, but then you're trying to refine it over time. And I think RIR fits into that picture pretty well, at least from a training programming standpoint. Because, like I said, it allows you to be versatile and allows you to adjust the training stimulus that you're imposing on a client. It's allowing you to adjust that. And that's important because stress levels change, right? The external environment changes. Physiology changes over time. At least it's impacted by the environment. And so the stimulus you impose on a client might also have to vary. So for me, it's about having those. Being a good coach means you have these systems and these thought processes in place that you can employ. And you might ask then, how does that look on a piece of paper? Right. And it can look so many different ways. Right. But for me, based on where things are heading, okay, we know in any given workout, we need a certain number of sets for a given muscle group to impose a sufficient overall tension stimulus. But of course, in each of those sets, we also need to be reaching a sufficient proximity to failure, right? We know fatigue and perceptual responses come into play here. So let's try and design a workout that has a combination of what I call just high threshold exercises that come with a lot of stress and a lot of systemic fatigue, and low threshold exercises that are more isolation based. So having a mix of those types of exercises with a sufficient set volume, making sure that we're in the strike zone, right, for each of those exercises. So for me, the strike zone is looking at like at least 2 reps. You got to be within 2 reps shy from that failure point. Practically, that's a message that I'm confident in conveying. And some exercises are going to be around that 1 to 2 RIR mark. Other exercises is going to be at failure, and that might be periodized across the session. Okay, so I think it's wise to potentially do that depending on what muscle groups you're training, because some muscle groups simply generate more overall fatigue than others, depending on the training frequency and other factors as well. So when it comes to RIR specifically, that is my thought process. It's okay, every set needs to be effective, right? So it's going to need to be within 2 reps shy from that failure point, right? But at certain points, we're gonna need to be confident pushing all the way to failure. And on other exercises, hey, let's keep a rep or two in reserve to preserve our ability to produce force and to manage fatigue. Okay, but again, that can look slightly different on paper for each individual.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's a great summary of it. And yeah, no, I like again, hey, this is what for example, probably mostly 2 RIR. Some are going to be 0 to 1, but again, it's ultimately going to come down to the exercises and the person as well, too. Like you said, it is just a tool there. Is there any, is there anything else on RIR that you want that maybe we missed or anything, or do you feel like we summed that aspect up pretty well?
I think we summed it up pretty well. I think
Okay.
that was a good summary of literature and some practical applications. So, yeah, I think when we're speaking about these topics, in many cases it's just like some people think when you're speaking about RIR, it's just coming from the research, right? What we know is it's just coming from the research. But what we have to realize is that all these research studies that I've spoken about, they all have specific research questions that they're trying to answer. And as coaches, right, as someone who's interested in practical application, the questions I'm trying to answer on the gym floor, they may be a little bit different to those said research questions, Jeff. So although I'm a researcher, people have this idea that researchers are always going to be just talking about the research, right? And that's limited because, hey, things play out differently on the gym floor. But I'm also coaching, I'm also on the gym floor, and I'm actually more interested in a practical discussion
Yeah.
with a scientific perspective. So I usually say I'm no more evidence-based coach than I am an individual who tries to employ the scientific perspective, right? I try and employ that perspective across all things in my life, and I try and improve that over time, improve my abilities to do that over time. I just so happen to be very interested in coaching and helping people get fit and build muscle. And that's my area of interest in research. So I'm employing that scientific perspective in this area of research as well and in my line of work. And the scientific perspective does not disregard practical application. The scientific perspective actually knows that research is bounded. The findings of research are bounded by the design and all the other factors that you read in the method section of a paper, which ironically not many people read. And that's the gap I'm trying to bridge here with my message. It's okay, this is how things play out in research, and these are the findings. Now, look, these findings, they're not going to be immediately carried over to the gym floor. That would be a misapplication of research. Like, you don't just take that finding and place it on the gym floor and start applying it. But it's also not wise to just disregard that area of research completely just because of pure anecdote or pure experience or bias. Who knows, right? There's so many different things that I observe here and there. I'm like, hey, I get where you're coming from, but it's also important to look at this research, even though it's limited, and try and bring things together. That's the gap that I'm trying to bridge, and it's a hard gap to bridge for many reasons. So yeah, if there's another takeaway, it's that, hey, the scientific perspective does not discriminate between research and practical application. At all times, we're trying to bring both together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And yeah, you do both. You do the research, but you also, like you said, work with clients one-on-one and actually have that you're able to apply these things practically as well too, which I think is key. Cause like you said,
Mhm.
sometimes they can get too far on the science side of things and we miss some of those
That's
conversations. Also, Martin, as always, man, a ton of great information in here. Looking forward to seeing you continue to put out research. And I'm sure next time we have you on, you'll have a few more that will be out and you'll probably be
right.
you'll be on the works for another one at some point, maybe. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's
appreciate
a
your
lot more
time.
coming, I can tell you that. Hopefully,
Awesome.
anyway.
Yeah.
Just
Looking
takes so
forward.
much time.
Yeah, no, it does. And the more I've had people on here that do research, man, the more I've realized like how long it actually
Okay,
really does take
sure.
for all of
Yeah,
it. Again, appreciate what you guys do and
thank you.
whatnot here. I guess before I let you go, anywhere where you want to lead the audience to or anything like that?
Yeah, best place is Instagram, MR Fitness with a double underscore. I'm not highly active in the sense that I don't post too much educational content. I prefer these discussions. So check out any of the podcasts that I've been on. And of course, the JPS education pages as well. If you're interested in specifically education, we have plenty courses that I've been involved in that you can check out online. And we do some face-to-face presenting and stuff as well. So if you're in Australia, check it out. If not, we have a bunch of content online.
Awesome. Yep. You guys are always putting out great information and I feel like you're putting it out all the time. So that's awesome. So awesome, Martin.
Awesome.
Appreciate your time in and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.